Okay, to talk all things Spurs, new era, power battles, power struggles, and where we are in terms of the sale potentially of Spurs, we have from the Fighting Cock Spurs podcast, Gareth Flavell and Simon Collings of The Standards. Thanks for coming on, both of you. Can we start, Flav, with Daniel Levy and what you sense is the overarching kind of sentiment towards his departure? Because over those years, those many years, he did polarize opinion quite a lot, didn't he?
Yeah, I think towards the latter part of his tenureship, for sure. I mean, I've gone through the whole process of thinking he's the best operator in football to certainly in the last 24 months thinking we can't even dream about winning the league while he's in charge. So it's important to look back at the whole 24 years of his tenureship and think holistically about how much he's moved the club forward. But I think generally in the Tottenham fan base, I'd assume that there is a kind of that everyone's kind of accepting and glad that he's gone, because we can dream of a future that might be a little bit more aggressive, a little bit more proactive, as opposed to reactive, which is essentially what Daniel Levy has sort of dined out on for years. So yeah, I think that there's a quiet optimism.
So is that what you think of the last 24 months, that he hasn't been proactive? Is that the main issue? And if so, where hasn't he been proactive? What do you mean by that?
Okay, so what we've seen in the last sort of 24 months, but especially the last 12 months, is football clubs begin to act differently in the transfer market, specifically in a way that Daniel Levy is not used to and completely uncomfortable with. And so in order to keep pace with the teams that we consider to be our rivals, like all of the big six in inverted commas, then we needed to be a little bit more aggressive and seemingly have a plan in place that meant that we get our targets when we want them. And I know that's sort of idealistic, but typically it would be looking at what other clubs have done in the transfer market and being reactive to the situation that Tottenham found themselves in. So a terrible example of this, but an example of it, is the signing of Xavi Simons, who was probably third in our list, probably wasn't even on the list. And it was only when the collapse of the Eze deal and him moving to our fiercest of rivals meant that it was a great example of his, I wouldn't say bumbling, but nitpicking at details, which meant that the deal would often fall through his fingers. And I feel, and I might be wrong, but it's my assumption, is that he just wasn't aggressive enough.
Does he have a point, Simon, do you think? Has that been something that's become increasingly obvious over the last couple of years? And when Flav says the way transfers happen has changed over the last 2 years, he's not kept up with that.
I mean, I think with Daniel Levy, you can never argue in terms of the business side of football, the job he's done. I mean, the legacy he's going to have there with the Tottenham Hotspur Stadium is pretty incredible. I think just from a sheer construction point of that redevelopment and getting it done, I think is amazing. I think the transfer side is interesting. And I think we've kind of seen the change at Tottenham there happening a bit with Johan Lange coming in. Certainly with other clubs, having kind of one person in charge of doing that transfer operation isn't really the way it's massively done. I think with Tottenham, certainly with Vinai coming in, I think you might see a bit more of the power being shared and diluted around and people having different responsibilities, rather than, I think, these days of sort of 10 to 15 years ago of two owners or chairmen thrashing out a deal together doesn't really happen anymore. I think recruitment departments are so vast now, and the game has evolved in that respect.
But if that, I suppose that is maybe the bigger fault then, would you say, Gareth, in that he didn't implement a structure under him until too late and tried to do a lot of these things himself, which maybe weren't his strengths in a modern era of football.
Yeah, I think, what was his strengths in 15 years ago, 10 years ago, even 5 years ago, suddenly became his weaknesses because of the way things changed. So I don't know if you guys know about this, but during the Conte era of Tottenham, there was an independent review of the structure of Tottenham and how the decisions are being made and why, despite the money being spent, we could never kind of bridge the gap between the top and sort of fifth or sixth place. And it's that report, which typically, I'm being told, generally, so you might take on some parts of the report to change the way you operate, but we've taken a lot from that report to make massive changes. You've seen Donna Cullen step down and Daniel Levy's now gone. That's huge seismic changes. And I just think for over the last 24 years, certainly maybe the last 23 years, Daniel Levy's really gone unchallenged because he has been de facto power broker at the football club. And that's fine because he did a good job and created a football club that as fans have an elevated expectation of what we should be able to achieve compared to the one that we had. And I remember it when he took over in 2001, which was, we had no hope really, maybe qualifying for the Europa League or the UEFA Cup through the Fair Play League was like I used to dream about that. So, we're a different football club now because of him. We should be grateful for it. But yeah, I think that perhaps he had too much control for too long. And if you believe reports, he was in the room with Steve Parish, chairman to chairman, which Simon says it's kind of like an archaic way of doing business. And he didn't get that deal done. So,
Simon, can we just kind of explain where the power lies in the club? Because he still has 30% of ENIC, which obviously a lot of protests in the club are aimed there. The Lewis family obviously own the whole company. So while he's not sitting in the room making those decisions and trying to bring players in and sell players, he's still got quite a sizable share of that company.
Yeah, he obviously still has a share in the company, but I think this past week or past 10 days or so has shown us that the real power here lies with the Lewis family. I think we can see their kind of influence growing. I think it's been reported this week in some of the newspapers about the sort of they're going to be showing a face at the West Ham game and kind of showing the driving forward and taking the club. I think an interesting point of that is obviously from a support viewpoint, Daniel Levy has often been the kind of focal point for criticism. He's been the kind of face of it. I think now he's gone, I think the Lewis family are going to be front and centre and everyone's going to see how is this going to play out because they have kind of taken authority of the situation and I think they're hoping they've got a structure in place that can drive success and I think they're quite bullish about the plans for success and investment going forward.
So do they want a structure in place to make the club successful or do they want a structure in place to make the club sellable?
Well, that's the question, isn't it? I mean, if you read the sort of messaging that's been coming out, they are targeting on-pitch success, aren't they? I think a lot of people will look at this as now an opportunity for Spurs to be on the market. The club have been very clear. I think we saw the statement, didn't we, only a day ago, where they're saying it's not for sale. We've seen the reports about Amanda Staveley, reports from Asia. I think if you are looking at clubs that you want to come and invest in, I think people will view Tottenham as that big asset. When you look at that stadium, it's an incredible stadium. I know I come back to it, but it's multifunctional. You've got concerts there, you've got NFL there. It is a huge club. But so far, the Lewis family have been clear that they don't want to sell.
The two are not mutually exclusive, are they? Because obviously it serves them to have success on the pitch. It drives up the price. They value the club around 4 billion, 3.5 billion. If you're getting into Champions League places and you look like an attractive football club as much as an attractive business, then that serves the purpose anyway, doesn't it? So I guess they want success on the pitch. They can say that because of course they do. They want success on the pitch. They're successful people, and that's what you want, Flav, and that's what Spurs fans want as well. So let's talk new eras and obviously Vinai coming in to do what, as far as you're aware.
I hope turn us into a football club that is that not essentially a multi-purpose franchise that does lots of things. That actually first and foremost we are a football team and a football club. And when you think of the Tottenham Hotspur Stadium, it's where Tottenham Hotspur play football, not where Beyonce turns up 5 nights a year. So I think that is key. I think that Vinai Venkatesham is very much football focused man. And has proved that past, working for that other football club in North London. And so where Daniel Levy had many interests and many amazing talents at, building revenue, but building things that brought money to the football club, Venkatesham, I would assume and I hope, is focused purely on, or as much as he can be, on the men's and women's team and developing those. So That's what I would see as a massive change in the right direction, because I don't think any of us is suddenly expecting us to blow £400 million in the transfer market because of the landscape of football and how restrictive spending can be, depending on your relative position in the league. So it's not that; it's just a change in energy, and it's what was mentioned at the start about being aggressive and being on the front foot and believing that Spurs belong at the top of the table rather than just making up places in the sort of Europa League spots.
Didn't this quite... I was just sort of thinking about this over the last 10 minutes as you were giving a couple of your answers, Gareth, really, which is, if you go back, I don't know, 10 to 15 years, Spurs were very good at finding unproven young talent and then turning. I mean, I know Kyle Walker had a lot of attention at Sheffield United, but Kyle Walker's quite a good example. There were several fullbacks of that Mauricio Pochettino era. They were good at finding those players and then turning them into something that other members of the top six then spent a so-called top six spent a lot of money on. That seems to have disappeared. And also, if you compare them to the other sort of elite clubs within the Premier League, Spurs haven't brought through their own players, have they, really,
No.
in the last decade? I mean, you certainly look at, I know you don't want to, but look at what Arsenal or maybe Chelsea have done. And Spurs feel massively behind there. Does that all come down to structure, do you think?
I think, look, I mean, it's a very difficult question to answer because there's so many facets to why we don't operate like that anymore. But yeah, there has been a massive issue despite the massive investment in the training centre, and it's supposed to be incredible and like the best in Europe and all that sort of stuff. But we haven't seen any players come through yet. And it's massively important with current PSR rules that you have or are able to produce players that you can sell on, even if they're not quite ready for the first team. So that is an issue. But to your first point, if you remember that Pochettino side, it was made up entirely of players that were unproven at Premier League level and then developed, including Harry Kane, right? So you had Harry Kane, you had Dele Alli, you had Huminson, who came from Germany. You got Eriksson, who came, I know he was touted, but Eriksson from Ajax, Vertonghen, Alderweireld, Kyle Walker, Danny Rose, Dembele in midfield from Fulham, Eric Dyer. So these are none of those players would have necessarily been fancied by Premier League clubs, and we had a blueprint there and an impeccable manager in Pochettino. Now, it would have there was a massive shift when Mourinho came in, because that development or that understanding of what we thought Tottenham were or was disappeared very quickly and continued to disappear into the Conte era, and this is where it started to fall apart for Daniel Levy in significant terms for the majority of the fan base, is that we'd lost what we thought we were. And I get why he did it. I understand bringing Mourinho in was very attractive, and I was excited at the time, and I didn't blame him. In hindsight, it was the wrong thing. And when you're at that level, you pay for bad decisions, and that's what he has done, I think.
Simon, let's go a little bit deeper into Vinai and what we think he is going to bring. And you've addressed it, Flav. He spent 14 years at Arsenal. So I know he's a businessman, and I know he's not, somebody who's kind of gone around kissing the badge and everything. But psychologically, is that a problem? Do you think does he have to kind of wash himself of his Gooner spirit before he can take on the job at Spurs? And then what did he do? That you think is proof that he can change something inherent in Spurs' kind of ability to get themselves where they think they should be.
Yeah, I don't think it's quite as extreme as the sort of Sol Campbell move across North London. I do remember interviewing Vinai a few years ago, and he sort of was very passionate about Arsenal and talk about if they sort of lost a game, he would take a longer drive home to try and cool off. But I think this is different to a player on the pitch. This is obviously a kind of higher executive kind of move. I think a big thing with Vinai and what he'll bring is communication. You speak to people at Arsenal, you speak to fans of Arsenal. That was a big thing, and it was noticeable when he left Arsenal. The Arsenal Supporters Trust put out a statement saying how sad they were about it, how much they'd enjoyed communicating with Vinai. He would come to forums, advisory boards. He would be there, particularly after the whole Super League incident, which was a disaster for a lot of those clubs involved with it. He was very much front facing and spoke to sports. And I think when we talk about new eras, the Lewis family, having someone who can communicate with fans is going to be vital. I think we've seen it in the past few days with Vinai taking the lead of that. So that's where I think he will be really key for them. I think also the women's side, again at Arsenal, he was one of the ones really pushing that. He was pushing them to play at the Emirates more. He was a driver of that. And then the business side of it. He has worked in football for 14 years at Arsenal, but before that, he was on the commercial team for London 2012. For Arsenal, that's where he started. He kind of moved up the ranks. But he will be very big on that. And that is something that Spurs will need to drive, because you look at the stadium, they've still not done the naming rights for that. And I think that'll be a big thing when they're moving forward that he'll want to get done.
But we've heard about the naming rights for so long, haven't we? And they still haven't been done. And that must be crucial for them as a business going forward for two reasons, I suppose. One, as Gareth has spoken about, PSR/squad cost going forward. They haven't got academy players or proven academy players that have come into the first team to be able to sell for pure profit. And after the sort of decision yesterday between the Premier League and Manchester City on associated sponsors and how that will work and market value, they're kind of at a disadvantage there in that their owners can't bring any of that to the table. I know it's still going to be monitored, but market value is very subjective, isn't it? So how much do they still feel they're having to play catch up a bit here?
It is a strange thing. I mean, you think that stadium's been 6 years in operation now, and you still don't have the rights for it. I think the last time I was looking that Levy spoke about it, I think was a couple of years ago at a fan Q&A, and he said they hadn't quite found the right sort of brand to match the values. And there is an extent of that, because kind of once you sell that naming rights, if you speak to people in business, it's very difficult to then sell that to a new brand. If you think of Arsenal and the Emirates, if a new brand came in and took over the name rights, you'd still find a lot of people in the street still calling that stadium the Emirates. So it's kind of a deal you've got to get right. And I think the interesting thing will be with City, if that Etihad deal goes through, which we think it will after the APT deal, is kind of what the market value is and what that shifts in terms of what clubs think they can get in. I think will be interesting. And I suppose Spurs' argument would be they've missed out on money perhaps in those previous years. But if you can now get a deal at a time when the market is increasing for stadium rights, then maybe it'll be a big benefit. But I think financially, that is something that I think people in the business world do find strange, that they haven't had a naming rights deal for a stadium that's been open this long.
So can just to kind of sum up the power within the club then right now, and where you see that both. Simon, go to you first on who is the person that's going to replace Daniel Levy. Will Vinai be alongside somebody else? Will there be somebody from the Lewis family represented? Who decides? Does anybody consult Thomas Frank? How is this going to work? If Daniel Levy had such a stranglehold on that before, there's obviously a vacuum there, isn't there?
Yeah, and
who feels it?
I think Vinai will take a key role in that in going forward in terms of leading the club. I think he will be a lot more front facing. I think the interesting to see will be whether at Arsenal it worked very well with Vinai when they almost kind of sort of divided the power at the top of the club, where Vinai would do a lot of the business side of it, a lot of the sort of commercial things, and then they had the footballing side, which Edu and Arteta would run together, and they kind of married up very well. It worked, a very slick operation. And I suppose at Spurs you could do that if you have Vinai sort of leading that, and then you've got Johan Lang and Thomas Frank working together. I think ultimately, though, what we've seen this last week is that the full power lies with the Lewis family, and this won't happen, or the sort of structure won't facilitate without their sort of approval and sign-off. But I think Vinai coming in is certainly going to be a key role, and that vacuum will need to be filled, and I think he will have a big say in things going forward.
Gareth?
Yeah, I think the vacuum is filled in the short term by Vinai Venkatesham, and with the knowledge that there is a strong football infrastructure beneath him, in Paratici coming back and Langer in place as director of football or technical director. And then you have Thomas Frank, which is an excellent coach. And obviously all of these stories kind of disappear if Spurs and questions and power vacuums and stuff like that disappear if Spurs are winning on the football pitch. And Thomas Frank's in an excellent position to do that. So I think in the short term, next 3 to 5 years, ENIC would look, my guess as a football fan would be that they would look to build, as you was mentioning earlier, Gabby, that build a football club, make them one that competes in the Champions League, increase the value of the club, and eventually it will be sold. I think it's inevitable that there will be some interest, and there has been interest from the Middle East and in America, and Spurs will be sold at some point in the future. But in the short term, I think there's enough there to steady the ship in these rocky waters that we find ourselves in at the moment.
Does this move give you a better chance of catching some of those other top clubs ahead of you? And if so, if you say in 3 to 5 years' time, in 3 years' time, where do you think you should finish in the league?
We have a better chance now Levy is gone than we. I think what's happened? The problem was, right? It's a difficult question to answer because it's impossible to predict. But the problem was Daniel Levy was okay with our position. He was fine with what Tottenham were, and that was one that meant that we could never interrupt what is the kind of elite teams in the Premier League. And we've done it once or twice, but really it was a flash in the pan, lightning in the bottle moment. In order for there to be any optimism in winning the league one day, because it is a dream, but it can happen, then something had to change. So whatever that is, we hope, and there's no guarantees, and the grass is always greener, and there are many cliches that you can use to describe the situation we find ourselves in, and there's no guarantee it gets better than when Daniel Levy is there. But how long do you maintain the status quo? And you have to dream and believe a little bit, and you have to, at this point, be optimistic about the future. So in 3 years, we'll win the league. Not if you want to predict.
I don't know, is it a very different role? But you actually got through that answer without mentioning Alan Kirbishley and Charlton, which is kind of what always happens in these situations. So well done.
Very true. Very
I've got to ask you as well, Flav, how you feel about your former manager, previous manager, coming back into the Premier League. Of course, Nuno was sacked late last night. We found out about it anyway. And Big Ange expected to be announced later today as Nottingham Forest new manager.
I'm very happy for him, I've genuinely over the last 2 years, despite witnessing hands down the worst domestic league I've ever experienced as a Spurs fan, we would have been relegated if it was any worse. But despite that, he has a magnetism and a charisma about him that's so rare in football management, and it's intoxicating. When he's at your football club, it is intoxicating. And I think he probably got a little bit more rope than he would have done because of how, infatuated many of us were with him. However, there should be some reservations and questions from the Forest support because he's completely different from Nuno, a completely different brand of football. And what they've got used to is being hard to beat, great on the counter. And what Ange Postecoglou's team isn't is hard to beat. And so they're going to have to get used to it, but they'll have a lot of fun and they will fall in love with him like we all did.
But they also, Simon, and you will know from, I'm guessing, your time of dealing with him, Forest will need to get the personality of Postecoglou from year one, not the sort of unhappy it did appear Postecoglou of year two.
Yeah, it is a big change in terms of styles from Nuno to Postecoglou. Is a big shift. And I remember I was lucky enough to go 2 years ago. It was when Ange had just been hired and they toured Australia. Luckily, Spurs, so just before the Women's World Cup, and I got to go see Spurs out there. And he did a sort of round table with 3 or 4 of us, and he was so engaging, so charismatic, and you could kind of see just his vision was so clear and that enthusiasm. If you remember back, I'm sure Gareth remembers those first sort of 10, 12 games of his era, the momentum that sort of swept him there and the energy he had was so key. And then it kind of drifted, didn't it, in that second season? But even right at the end, you talk about how he can lure you in. That speech he gave after the trophy parade. And I remember there were a lot of Spurs fans who before that speech were like, he's got to go. And then they hear the speech and they're like, actually, let's do one more season. So I think
I was there. I was on radio. The BBC rang me up literally after we'd been sacked, and I weren't in tears because I'm a grown man, right? But I was like pretty emotional. I'm really angry at Daniel Levy. Like, how could you delivered the first trophy in years? How could you do this, Daniel? And then obviously the dust settles a little bit, and then the emotions are gone, and then obviously the speech was just a week ago, and then you started thinking, wow. Did finish 17th, didn't we? So, yeah, it was a mental. Sorry, Simon.
That's it, Gareth. BBC Radio are always there to get you in your moment of grief. We're all,
Weakness. I did think at the time the speech was partly something kind of like a rallying cry stroke extra kind of line on his CV for the next job, because it was like, look, whatever you think about me, you're going to get a lot of passion and you're going to get a lot of laughs and a lot of clickbait as well with me. And as we've discussed before you guys came on, at the moment, if Nottingham Forest are anything, they are one of the most talked about, one of the most clicked football clubs in terms of the drama that goes on around them. So he fits into all of that really well.
Yeah, and he did also showed some pragmatism, I think, in that Europa League run, didn't he? There was a kind of shift in the style. I think for the Premier League, it's quite exciting to have Ange back, particularly if we get the Ange back from that first season. I know from his press conferences, he could be very entertaining, but I mean, it is crazy that he's going into that job and his first game is away to Arsenal with Ange being there. And Edu obviously should be back in the director's box for the first time since he left the club. So if there was anything to get fans wishing the international break was over, I think that being the opening game is pretty much it.
The Sports Agents
with Gabby Logan and Mark Chapman.